Hi, welcome to Watch It Play Table Talk Back. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video we're going to take a look at your responses to the question, what can rulebooks do to improve the learning process? Some rules for rulebooks. And I got a number of responses which I've compiled, tried to remove duplicates, and reword things so they're as succinct as possible, because my hope is that future rules writers, designers, and publishers can look at this video and maybe get some helpful advice in their own projects. So let's dive right in. Paul Breads writes, beyond learning the game, a rulebook will often be used as a reference, and so it should also serve that purpose well. Paul, this is such an important aspect to raise, because even if your rulebook is comprehensive in terms of providing the information necessary to learn the game, once you've read a rulebook once, maybe 2 times, the main reason you'll go back to it is just to find that one rule you've forgotten, or because your friends are currently arguing over the answer to a question and you just want to find that answer so you can get back to the fun of the game. So the rulebook not only needs to provide the information, but it needs to provide easy ways to find the information inside of it. With that in mind, Terry Bell suggests that margin rules are useful guides when teaching and looking for rules clarifications. Now, we can see an example of this in the game Castles of Burgundy. Let me quickly show you. You'll see here the details are in the main text, but then you have a summary of the key concepts over here, which is helpful when you're just going back to find something quickly. Also, as Clyde Irwin says, a thorough keyword and rules index with numbered pages is invaluable for quickly finding information. Here's the rulebook for Combat Commander. Not only does it have a table of contents in the front, but on the back it's got a full index with all kinds of various terms and specific pages and paragraphs to where those are found. Chris McPherson also reminds us that you should ensure the start of any new concept or segment is clearly identified. For example, in Dead of Winter, each new idea is segmented and titled, so in this way, the whole rulebook isn't just a wall of text, but a variety of different sections to draw your eye when you're looking for something. Ruth Ashton writes, terms within the rules should be defined at their first use, so that readers don't have to search for the definition. Of course, because rulebooks are books. And we read books from start to finish, sequentially. So if you introduce a rule to me on page 3 with terms that you're not going to explain until page 7, you're just confusing me on page 3. And you don't want to do that. So as Ruth says, the best thing to do is explain that term as soon as you use it, or you might even have a page near the beginning of the rulebook that says, here's some commonly used terms and their definitions. At least that way, I've seen there's some unique terms and I know where to look when I come across some of those funky rules a little bit later. Warren Smith writes, use different fonts or colors to distinguish flavor text and historical interest points from actual rules. I buy a game to play it, which I'm sure is true for most of you, not to spend extra time in the rule book. And fluff kind of creates that extra time of either being distracted reading it or just trying to figure out how to get past it so you can get back to the actual rule book. If you think that you really need to include some fluff, I recommend grouping it together and putting it at the back of your rulebook. Remember, again, your rulebook is primarily going to be used as a reference once people have read it through. So when I'm trying to find the answer to a timing conflict, I don't want to have to be trying to pick through information on the War of 1812 and George Washington's hairstylist. I just want the answer to my question so I can get back to my game. And I think the best way of doing that is either to move all that fluff to the back, or as Warren says, make it so separate from the actual rules in terms of its visual quality that I can just effortlessly ignore it. Martin V writes, avoid the overuse of acronyms and special terms. I want to emphasize overuse. That's where I think the real problem is. A few acronyms, for example, replacing intelligence with INT, might be an efficient way of putting that term on multiple components where you don't have a lot of space. But every time you introduce a new acronym, it's something else I have to memorize on top of the rules concept that acronym is meant to represent. And there's no need to get clever. If there's already a particular term commonly used for something, you don't need to come up with your own unique thematic term. I'm looking at you, Android Netrunner, calling my hand of cards a grip. In a similar way, Dustin Schwartz says oftentimes you can reduce the number of keywords required in your game. Now that might be more of a game design choice than a rules writing one, but certainly the number of keywords is going to affect your rulebook and its clarity, so it's something to consider in your design choices. Dave S. writes, do not assume the reader is familiar with certain terms just because they're commonly used by gamers. For example, drafting cards. You just don't know the experience level of the person who's bought your game, so yes, explain every concept. Within reason. I mean, if you tell the players to put the board in the center of the table, you probably don't have to define what a table is. Chris Laudermilk writes, avoid creating situations where you have to jump from one section of the rules to another, sometimes several pages, just to get a clear picture of a single mechanism. Sometimes you will have a rule that relies on a separate rule that really deserves its own separate explanation, and maybe other rules are also going to interact with it. But my recommendation is, instead of putting that rule 5 pages later, put it in the same area where it's first talked about. And then when it's brought up later, refer readers back to that concept, because it's a concept they've already read in the course of reading the rulebook sequentially, as opposed to a concept that's somewhere off in the future of their reading that they haven't even really gotten to yet. I think it's always better to point people backwards than forwards into the unknown abyss of the rulebook. Eric Gergotz writes, clarify rules with examples. Now, as text, game concepts are pretty abstract, but if you can provide an example, and especially if there's some images, it brings those concepts to life. It really shows the player, here's how this works. And I would really advise that you use the more complex examples where possible, because those are the areas where most people are going to have difficulty. And often a couple of pictures with some text explaining what's going on just clears that right up. Now, with a couple of other great suggestions, we have a video contribution from Jacob of Meeple Leaf Reviews.
Now, my 2 favorite things in rulebooks are simple. First are PDF versions for easy scrolling, and even a search function to help find that rules reference that much quicker. The second is a rules reference sheet, either on the back of the rulebook or on a reference card to hand out to players. And whether it be a turn breakdown or all the actions you can take, nothing makes a game quicker and easier to learn than a rules reference guide.
Alex M. writes, include a picture showing what the game looks like when it's set up. This is really helpful when you're first putting the game on the table and trying to figure out where all the different components go. But beyond that, just when you're reading the rulebook itself, it's helpful to have an image to refer back to as you're trying to imagine how these different rules and game concepts are going to move things around. It gives you a framework to understand those different ideas. Rylan also recommends including a full list of the components with images, especially if similar components only have slight variations. You might have a deck of cards that you need to separate into various piles, and the only way to distinguish the difference between them are maybe some slight color differences or some text written on some aspect of the card. So having that identified in the components list won't only help you with the setup, but it also helps players determine if maybe some components are missing. Joe Salamone writes, be clear about whether components are meant to be limited or unlimited. In other words, once you've used up all of a component, are you allowed to use a suitable replacement to keep dealing out that component to players as needed? Or once you're out, are you out? It's not always clear, and different games have different rules for this, so if yours don't specify, it's not always going to be immediately obvious what to do. Joe also mentions that you should be clear about whether information should be public knowledge or hidden. Again, you might assume, listen, if you dealt cards to someone, obviously that's private and they're not allowed to show anyone. But not all games work that way. Sometimes you are allowed to share information with your opponents or allies in the game. Make sure that's clear. Alex Rodriguez says, be careful how you use the terms you and your. Sometimes it can be less ambiguous to use terms like active player and target player. Right, because sometimes when you're reading a rulebook, if it says you, you're not sure if it means you as the reader, you as a player, and if a player, then which player? Like if it's my turn or somebody else's turn. Mark Cook writes, use gender-neutral terms where possible. I like this suggestion because when I'm reading a rulebook, I often put myself in the position of the player that the rules are referring to. So I find it a bit jarring and distracting when they refer to me as a she, because I'm not. So suddenly I don't feel like the rulebook is talking to me anymore. Likewise, if my wife is reading a rulebook and it's constantly referring to, the player moves here, then he does this, then he does that. She's not a he. So are these rules not being written to her? Now, of course, I understand that the male pronoun has been used for a long time to represent everybody. But if I find it a bit jarring to be referred to as a she, I'm sure some of our female counterparts find it jarring to be referred to as a he. And now we have various genders that self-identify as well. So I would just prefer to leave gender out of the rulebook. I don't think it really has a place there. I'd rather be as inclusive as possible. Ian O'Toole writes, The rulebook is not the place to sell the theme. Now, we touched on this a little bit when we talked earlier about fluff being included in the rules, but Ian, as a graphic designer here, I'm pretty sure is referring to also the graphical presentation, the font, the text size, those sorts of things. And Jacob from Maple Leaf Reviews has a couple of good examples of problematic theme selling in a rulebook.
Take, for example, Jamaica, the pirate racing game, whose rulebook is a treasure map. How clever. Can you imagine whipping this out at the table every time you had a rules question? Or how about Sentinels of the Multiverse First Edition Rulebook, which boasted 10 biographies consuming 25% of the rulebook, scattered from page to page, and had nothing to do with learning the game. And while I can appreciate the dedication to the theme and character development, I wish they would have put the rules in the front of the book and the biographies in the back half, which is what they ended up doing with second edition.
Patrick Doss writes, mind your grammar and your spelling. I know we live in an age where creative spelling is often encouraged. Can I has cheeseburger? But in a rulebook, not only are misspelled words distracting and improper grammar confusing, but the reason why rules mistakes often end up in a rulebook is because someone has not carefully gone over it. So how confident can I be that you got your rules right if you cannot get the spelling of words correct? Timothy Young writes, it can be helpful to include why a rule exists. Yeah, I think this is especially true if the rule is particularly fiddly, maybe a little less intuitive. If you know why it's there, it can help you remember and really see its purpose. This is also one area where perhaps a little bit of fluff in the rules can be useful. If you can tie a rule to the theme in a very quick and succinct way, then it can help you when you're playing to remember that rule and why it's there and how to use it. Marco Crivello writes, if you get your rulebook translated, ensure it's reviewed by a native speaker in the new language. Your translation could be technically correct, but functionally it could be a complete disaster because every language has its own unique nuance. And you need to understand that nuance and ensure it's coming across correctly if you want your rulebook to be usable. This next suggestion from Keith Collins is the one that by far I am the most passionate about because I truly believe most designers and publishers don't do this step and it results in so many of the problems that we encounter. Keith writes, blind play test your rulebook. Give the game and the rulebook to players who have never played before and have them learn only from the rulebook and watch them play. If you have to answer questions in order for them to be able to play, your rulebook doesn't work. If they're staring at the book and constantly referencing the rules as they play, your rulebook doesn't work. And if they're arguing over rules interpretations, your rulebook doesn't work. I'm confident that many of you, like me, have sat down to play a game, and within the first 5 minutes, you've encountered a situation that you're certain everyone who plays this game is going to run into, and yet the rules, they don't address it at all. How does this happen? Well, I think primarily it's because the people who write the rules are the people who either design the game or just intimately familiar with it, so they're just not aware of what's obvious and isn't obvious. And so they have a blind spot for those rules that need to be cleaned up, that just need to actually be in the rulebook. So by doing a blind play test, you're going to get a lot of feedback about things that are confusing, the things that are not obvious, and you'll have a chance to build those into the rulebook. So please, 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 blind play test. Don't give your rulebook to your play testers. They know your game too well. They're not going to see the problems either. Give them to people who have not played the game. Trevor Cummins writes, if the frequently asked questions document is longer than your rulebook, it's time to rewrite your rulebook. I'm okay with frequently asked questions documents or errata. Those are necessary and essential. But once they get really long, it's time to replace your rulebook. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Robinson Crusoe. Mike says, I've been a technical writer for many years now. It's my job to write manuals. The problem is publishers are not willing to pay a professional to write their rulebook. Yeah, Mike, this is a problem. In a lot of cases, I think the publisher relies on the designer to do this kind of work because, hey, the designer knows their game. Surely they can write out all the rules. Well, first of all, this is not entirely true. That's why blind playtesting needs to be done. But also, being able to write out your rules is not the same as being able to write out your rules well, right? And that takes a certain kind of expertise. I can tell when I read a rule book designed by a professional. Ian O'Toole is one of those professionals. His comment was earlier in this video. And when I get to the end of one of the rule books he's worked on, wow, can you ever tell the difference? The coordination of all the graphic design, the iconography, the text, the layout, it all works together so beautifully. If you want an example of this, you can check out the game The Gallerist and any other ones that he's worked on. He's truly a professional. And that kind of professional work is going to come from someone who is specialized, not from someone who's a generalist. So this is a skill that's a good idea to invest in. Marcel Porgolewski writes, all games should have 2 links at the end of the rulebook, one for the frequently asked questions document and one for errata. I definitely agree. As someone who's been gaming in the hobby for a few years now, I'm pretty used to going to Board Game Geek or to going to the publisher's website to look for that kind of documentation. But a new gamer might not realize those kinds of documents get created. Ray wrote, companies should use the services of Watch It Played. People often learn best from being taught. Well, Ray, thank you. I know this is a little self-serving for me to be the one reading this out, but I do believe that you don't have to rely just on the rulebook to help teach your game. The rulebook should be a good tool, but you can also supplement that with instructional videos like the ones that we create. I work with the designers and publishers of the game to ensure that we have the most up-to-date rules, that the errata is included, and to try to clear up any confusion that they've noticed people having with the game. So hopefully that makes Watch It Played and the videos we create here a useful service.
Rules. No, not Rodney rules, but rulebooks. Rulebooks should be spaced out and be illustrated with lots of images and not just be all squeezed in with text. Rulebooks should explain all the components in the game and not have you wondering what the hell this is supposed to be. Medium to hard games should come with a reference manual so those that are used to playing these games can jump straight into it. So newbies can flick through the glossary for terms that they don't understand. Translations. If a game is being translated, don't use words which are in the original language. And being someone that has to buy games in a different language, I have to photocopy translations. And because it's a direct copy, the French version makes more sense than the English version, which doesn't make sense. Rulebooks should ensure you that you are contractually going to understand the game and not look like a contract for an insurance. Finally, Mr. McDonald. A first player rule in the rulebook is stupid because I'm not the youngest, I'm not the tallest, I'm not the one that's visited the most countries, I'm not the winner of the last game, and therefore, I'm never the first player. Dude, I just dribbled. Oh, and finally, rulebooks should have links to websites where you can watch videos.
While I have your attention, there is one other thing I'd love to see included with the rules of games. Instructions for how the components are supposed to go back into the insert. Our friends over at Navu Games heard me vocalize this concern, and they actually printed out a little graphic showing, hey, here's how our components go back in our game. I love that initiative. Here's the game, El Grande, the big box edition. It's got all kinds of little pockets for different things. This would be just terrible trying to figure out where everything should go. What they include in the game? This wonderful sheet showing all the components and where they go. Brilliant. If you have any kind of insert in your game, especially if there's multiple different ways that insert could be used, include a sheet and clear things up. I want to thank everyone for all the wonderful contributions to this topic. I found it really enlightening. I hope you did as well, and I hope some publishers and designers and rules writers find something interesting in here as well that they can take away. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.